Welcome back to Lard Island for this part 4 of the Sharp Practice series of videos. They say that the show isn't over until the fat lady sings. Well, you saw Fat Nick detailing some of the core elements of the rules in the last video, and that really ended the nuts and bolts stuff. Now we need to look at what makes the rules unique and makes the game so interesting. Let's start out with a look at the turn sequence. If you're familiar with Lardy rules, this may appear familiar, but in fact there are some real innovations and changes which we need to highlight. We hear an awful lot about card-driven game systems. People love them or hate them, but the truth is that the term card-driven can mean many different things. If you played at the first edition of Sharp Practice, you'll find this to be a very different game entirely. In the past, many of our games used a card-driven order of play to introduce some chaos to the game. One card would end the turn, and that would be that. If your unit hadn't been activated, it would lose out. Here, we have something quite different, and that key change is determined by the way the turn sequence works. For a start, the rules are no longer dependent entirely on cards. We offer a choice of cards which you can shuffle into a game deck, or the alternative of using poker chips drawn from a bag. Either way, the cards or the chips determine the order of play, but it's not as two-dimensional as it sounds. The game deck, and let's call it that, whether it's indeed cards or whether you're going to go with poker chips, is made up of one card for each leader in the game. So a core force with a typical amount of support will probably have 4 or 5 leaders in the deck. Not unusually, when a leader's card is dealt, he can use his command initiative to activate men under his command. If you played Chain of Command or any of our other rule sets, this will be quite recognisable. Leaders have a status level ranging from 1 to 4. The higher the status level, the more they can do. So a status 1 leader can do one thing, a status 3 leader can do 3 things. What they can do is largely activating troops under their command or rallying any troops who've suffered shock. In other words, that negative morale effect. You do get some other clever stuff like forming 2 groups into a formation so they become more effective, but really the leader is there to get troops doing things and keep them under command by getting rid of shock points, those negative cohesion and morale points which ultimately will see your men quit the field, as Nick told us last time. But that's not all. As well as the leader cards in the game deck, we have some really very important cards which change the game completely. These are the command cards. So, what does a command card look like? Quite simply, it's a card or a poker chip with a flag on it. The flag will be either red or blue, depending on which side it applies to. A typical force will have 4 of these in the game deck. Simple as it looks, it's the key to getting your troops to perform to the best of their abilities. As with all of our rules, what we've attempted to do is to distill down into the game the key element of the warfare we're trying to represent. In a skirmish in the Black Powder era, this is all about getting your men to outperform their enemy, to move faster, to load more quickly so they can fire more rounds a minute. A classic embodiment of this is the leader exhorting his men to fire 3 rounds a minute. The side which can achieve this will win the firefight, and so it is in Sharp Practice. The command cards allow us to lift the performance of our leaders and our troops so that they achieve more than the average. The question is, how do we apply them to achieve this? When a command card is dealt, it's left in play, ready to be used by the player who owns it. So the red side can use the red cards, the blue side, the blue cards. Some people prefer to hand the cards to the relevant player so that he can play them as a hand of cards. It's up to you how you do it. If you have a single command card, a leader can use that when he's activated to increase his status level by 1 for that turn. So for example, if a status 2 leader is with a group which really needs rallying as it has a lot of shock, he could use that card to increase his status to 3 for this turn and rally off 3 points of shock rather than 2. If you have 2 command cards, the player can use them to interrupt the turn to activate any unit to take its go immediately. This can be handy if you're in a firefight and you really want to get your volley in before your opponent fires. If you have 3 command cards, a leader may interrupt the turn and take his go immediately. This is slightly better than just activating the unit because the leader can rally shock as well as getting the unit to fire. If you have 4 command cards, and this is obviously extreme because there are only 4 in the deck, a leader can take a bonus move, activating even if he's already activated in that turn. Nice if you can manage it. However, remember I mentioned that turn end card? Well, we have one here. But when the Tiffin card is played, that tells us not that the turn's ended, but that it's about to end. Unlike the first edition of the rules, it doesn't end instantly. Any command cards now in play have a very different use. Each one can now be used to activate any unit which has not been activated during the turn. As we can see, the player is faced with a lot of choices. He could play the cards during the turn to get an immediate benefit, or he could leave all of his cards to the end of the turn, allowing a strong possibility that he can activate lots of units. But possibly that could be after his opponent has already activated his units and done significant damage. And of course there is the chance that if he leaves his cards until the end of the turn, that those units could already have been activated by their leaders, in which case the command cards are wasted. Equally, the player hanging on to try and get 4 cards and that elusive bonus move needs to seriously consider the odds of that happening before the Tiffin card is dealt. But there's more. The command cards do far more than simply allow units and leaders to interrupt the turn. They also trigger unit characteristics. Let's look at one unit and I'll show you what we mean. Here we can see what we call a unit roster. It shows some pretty obvious stuff like what the unit's called, in this case British Regulars from the American War of Independence, what it's armed with, how many men are in a group, the quality of the group. As we can see, this unit is rated as regular troops, but the roster allows us to provide much more detail than that. On the next line we have several boxes which allow us to really tailor-make every unit to represent its very specific abilities. Here you can see formation. This tells us if a group of these troops can form up with other troops of the same type into a formation. So that could be a larger line or a column which allows it to be controlled more easily. Naturally, British Regulars can always do this with no limitations. Some troops can only do this while in good order, so with no shock on them, and some less organised troops can never do it. Next, we see if the unit gets a first fire bonus. Decent troops will have ensured that their first round is well loaded with a measured charge of powder, and so get a bonus the first time they fire. Poorer quality troops, such as militia, might not get this at all. Next is whether they can fire a controlled volley. Fire discipline's an important differentiator in the black powder era. Some troops, like these British Regulars, can fire controlled volleys all day long. Some troops can only fire their first volley in a controlled manner, and others can only fire uncontrolled volleys. These 3 boxes are all very straightforward. Troops can do it, or they can't, or maybe they can sometimes do it. However, the next 3 boxes are different, as they are influenced by the use of command cards. So, a crashing volley is a well-delivered volley timed by the leader choosing the right moment to fire. Step out allows the leader to drive his troops forward, adding an additional d6 of movement in a turn. Drill is similar, but it allows troops to change formation more rapidly. Now, with all 3 of these, there's a numerical value shown. This is how many cards are played in order to trigger that effect. So, here we can see that a unit of British Regulars can deliver a crashing volley if they spend 2 command cards when they fire. Or they can use those command cards to advance more rapidly by stepping out, and so on. Let's contrast that by looking at state line troops on the US side up to 1777. So this is before Valley Forge and Washington's attempts to reshape the army. Here we see a very different picture. No controlled volleys, no chance of a swift formation change, and achieving a crashing volley or stepping out to get that extra dice of movement requires 3 command cards. Interesting contrast, and one that shows how we can use the rosters to develop some very different and interesting troop types. But that's not all. Here, looking at British regulars again, we can see that the final box lists characteristics. So here we have sharp practice, which allows faster reloading and firing in that turn. And this is triggered by command cards as well, as are other unit characteristics, which could be listed here, such as thin red line for British firing a volley and then charging up, or pas de charge for the French driving forward and rallying shock off as they advance in column of attack towards their enemy. Again, we're seeing that the command cards are much in demand and can do a lot of things to really enhance the performance of a unit. However, it is most certainly a finite resource. The player needs to think carefully about when to play the cards and when to keep them in hand. In a nutshell, sharp practice is about attempting to elevate your troops at the critical moment, lifting them from average to get them to perform at their best by use of a limited amount of command resources. Can you get your men to fire 3 rounds a minute in the face of a French column beating out the pas de charge? Sharp practice is your chance to find out. Okay, that's all for this time. I hope we've been able to explain this key part of the game, as this really is what is at the heart of the system and what makes it so much fun to play. As we saw with Nick in the last video, we've kept the rules very simple and streamlined so that the players can retain their focus on this, the command element of the game. As always, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to see covered, just leave a note on the YouTube channel and we'll do all we can to answer you. Next time, the Fat Lad and I will be back to look at a game in play so you can see these mechanisms in action. For now, thanks for watching and we hope to see you soon.